Hello there, ladies. This is the new booklet that we're about to start looking at, which is Course Companion 5. It's actually Course Companion 5A. There are two in Course Companion 5 series. One is A and the second one is B. We're going to be looking at Course Companion 5A, which I've put onto the Teams files area, and I'll talk to you about where that is in a minute. But basically, it started with a new booklet, and we're basically looking at perfect competition, imperfectly competitive markets, and monopoly. So this is a fairly chunky area, but it will actually pick up on some of the stuff that we picked up on previously. Okay, so fundamentally, we're going to go through and do a bit of an intro to this section, looking at market structures and the learning objectives, and also starting to look at some of the individual content that you're going to need to be able to consider as we go through this. Okay, now I think I'm going to try, I'm not going to sure whether this is going to work or not, but I'm going to try and show you where the original booklet is so that you can see that. So hopefully you'll be able to follow this on screen. So I'm just going to come out of the PowerPoint, and I'll come back to look at that in a minute. But if we take a quick look at where exactly this is, what we should be able to do, hopefully in a minute, is that going to let me do it? Yes, it is, I think. I'm assuming I'm still there. If you go into your Microsoft Teams area, and this actually happens to be, let's just go into the correct part, to go into Teams, go into all Teams. Well, we don't need to because we're actually in Economics A pure. Okay, and you can see these are some of the assignments that you've done previously. If you go into Files, click on Files, just go then click on Class Materials. You will then see there is now a new folder called CC5 Perfect Competition, Imperfectly Competitive Markets and Monopoly. Click on that, and basically you will have the Word document, which is essentially 5A, which is the booklet we're going to go through, and you have the first PowerPoint presentation for CC5 as well. So that's where they are. They are actually already uploaded onto your files area on Teams, and it should be a relatively straightforward process for you to get hold of the info that you need. Okay, now the other thing I'm going to try and do is also get you the hard copy of Course Companion 5A and 5B to you, because they're already printed out and sat in school at the moment. Now what I'm going to do is, if you can actually come and pick them up from school, that would be great. It will just save us a bit of time and effort. But if you're not able to, if you can just let me know. So one or two of you have already done so, and I will get them posted out to you so that you've got the hard copy should you want to. And obviously in the short term, you've got it digitally already, and if you really want to, you can obviously print it off at home, if that works for you, rather than having to come into school. So it's entirely up to you how you want to work it. Okay, so that's a bit of a slight detour, but hopefully that makes some sense. And what we'll do now is move back to look at what we were looking at before, which was the start of this Course Companion 5A. Okay, so the subject area is we're still looking at microeconomics, so we're still talking about individuals, firms, markets, and market failure, but now we're moving on to look at different types of market structure. And I think hopefully this will actually start to make a lot more sense when you put into context some of the things we've been talking about in terms of production costs and revenue, which have been slightly abstract and not necessarily that easy to relate to something. What we should be able to do is, if I do it properly and you understand it, we should be able to start relating a lot of that production cost and revenue stuff to different types of market structure. Okay, and that's basically what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on, and I'm going to move myself over here a bit so you can see what we're talking about. So the learning objectives we're going to cover, and this is basically following, as I mentioned, Course Companion 5A, and effectively we're going to go through the first few pages on in this booklet, and obviously you can add context and text and extra items to each of the pages should you wish to. Okay, so in essence what we need to do in this case, and this is again straight from the original exam spec, but the learning objectives for this particular unit are as follows. Every time I move myself, I end up not being able to move into the PowerPoint without clicking again. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. My problem, not yours. So the first thing we're going to need to understand is profit maximization. We talked briefly about profit maximization in the previous unit. And remember, that is basically where MC equals MR. So a profit maximizing firm will actually keep producing to the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So for the extra unit that's produced, the marginal cost is provided the marginal revenue is higher than the marginal cost, then a profit maximizing firm will carry on producing output because it can still make profit. Okay, but different market structures mean that profit maximization is done in a slightly different way and has slightly different outcomes as a result. We're also going to look at things like the different types of market structure, and that will range from perfect competition at one end of the scale to monopoly at the other end of the scale. And we'll look to see whether perfect competition is more efficient than monopoly. We're also going to look at something called monopolistic competition and oligopoly, which are both forms of imperfect competition. So we'll range from looking at a perfectly competitive market right the way through to looking at the most severe form of imperfect competition, and we'll explain the differences between those as we go. We're also going to look at something called concentration ratios and how you can use those to define whether a market structure is oligopolistic. I'm not going to explain what that means yet. Some of you might be familiar with it, particularly if you've done some economics before, but we'll look at the difference between some of these terms and terminology in terms of market structure and how you can actually decide whether a particular type of market is a particular type of market structure. We're then going to look at oligopolies in some more detail in terms of market behavior and conduct in the context of the interdependence between oligopolies. Now, an oligopolistic market is where you've got a few very big players, probably 4 or 5 big competitors, but there are a number of other smaller competitors too. And probably the best example, one of the best examples I can think of, is the supermarket sector, where you've got a range of fairly big players, but also got a range of slightly smaller ones. And you could also apply it to the coffee market in the UK, particularly the coffee shop market. And we'll talk about the way in which you can compare and contrast those. And they are very good examples should you need to refer to examples when it comes to giving some context to the sort of answers that you might have to put together when you're answering questions on market structure. So we'll also look at the difference between competitive and collusive oligopoly. Again, some of these terms you may not be that familiar with, but we'll look at each one in turn. We're also going to look at why and how firms undertake something called price discrimination. And that's where basically firms choose to price the same product at different levels with different audiences and how and why they do that. We'll also look at different forms of economic efficiency and the way in which different forms of market structure either help to achieve those forms of economic efficiency or whether they actually don't allow those economic efficiencies to happen. We'll look at dynamic efficiency and how that relates to the process of creative destruction and how firms compete in real world markets. Now, we talked briefly about creative destruction right at the end of Unit 4, CC4, if you remember. So it's the process of new technologies coming in, new innovations happening, and how that's changing old market systems and creating new ones effectively. We'll also look at welfare criteria and the principle of consumer surplus and producer surplus, and how you can use that to evaluate the different types of market structure that exist. Okay, some of you again may be familiar. We have touched on it very briefly about consumer surplus and producer surplus, but we'll look at that in some more detail over the course of the next few weeks, as I've mentioned. So those basically are the learning objectives. Now, the most important thing to remember in this instance is that we've got different types of market structure. Okay, now in this instance, and this slide covers quite a lot of content, but which we'll go into in quite a lot of detail in the future. But fundamentally, we've got a spectrum of market structures, and this is shown on page 4 in your booklet. Okay, now effectively, you've got a range of different types of market structure that you will need to understand and be able to explain. Okay, now the most competitive type of market structure is one that's known as the perfectly competitive or perfect competition market structure. Okay, now it explains a little bit about how a perfectly competitive market is structured and some of the criteria that it needs to meet in order to be known as a perfectly competitive market, and that is considered to be the most competitive sort of market that any business would be involved in from an economic standpoint. And it ranges from on the left hand side over here, perfectly competitive markets, right the way through to monopoly positions, which are considered to be the least competitive. So in this instance, the monopoly, it's a relatively simple example to explain. Basically, there's one firm that produces all the output within a market. Now, in fact, true and pure monopolies are very few and far between in this day and age. But if we assume in this case that the monopoly market structure is where you've got a firm that has significant market power or monopoly power and is able then to set prices, is basically a price maker. Okay, now if we then go to the other end of the scale and look at perfectly competitive markets, and guys, I'm doing this in a very brief way, we'll look at each one in a lot more detail as we go through the course of this booklet. Okay, so a perfectly competitive market has a number of very specific things. I think there are 6 in total. There are 2 mentioned here, 2 of the key things, but we'll look at, or 3 in fact, but we'll look at a number of others as well. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are always going to be a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. The sellers are selling exactly the same products. They're homogeneous. The products are exactly the same. And the market price is actually set by the market, not by the individual sellers. They have no influence over the price that they can charge for the market to the market. So there are some key fundamentals for a market to be considered to be perfect, a perfectly competitive market, that there are those and a number of other things that have to be considered. Okay, you've then got something in a situation which is slightly moving to be slightly more competitive than a perfectly competitive market, and that's when you've got something called monopolistic competition. And that's where, again, you've got a large number of buyers and sellers. But in this case, you've got differentiated products actually that are slightly different from one another. And in that situation, because of that, the individual sellers are able to price make. So they can charge different prices for their goods and services because they are different from some of the other people in that marketplace. Okay, so similar to perfect competition, but where you've got differentiated products, and in that case, you are able to then influence the price of your that you can sell your product at. Then we've got oligopoly, which is significantly further over towards the least competitive market. Okay, so in this instance, you've got a few firms that dominate the market, and those businesses are able, again, to provide differentiated products and services, and then they can decide on the price. They can set prices in certain ways. And we're going to look at each one of these in quite a lot more detail. So we're just sort of scratching the surface in a sense. And we've already looked at monopoly. Okay, so those are the 4 different types of market structure that you're going to need to understand and also be able to demonstrate and show graphically what some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these different forms of market structure are. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this booklet, you'll be very comfortable to do that. And in this instance, remember, the market structure is basically, if we're going to try and define it, it's the characteristics of a market which determine different firms' behaviours. Okay, and we'll look at that in some more details I'll keep mentioning as we go through the booklet. So that finishes off page 4. Okay, now in essence, we're going to then look at how that then affects the way in which organisations behave. Okay, so let's take a look on page 5 in your booklet at the characteristics which influence market structure. Again, I'm going to shift my Visog over there a bit so that you can actually read the content that we're going to look at rather than see my ugly mug. So in this instance, then, the characteristics which influence market structure are, number one, going to be the size, the number of firms in a market, okay, and also their relative size. So clearly, if there are lots and lots of different firms in the market, that's going to suggest that there is a significant amount of competition, but also their relative size is quite important, because if you've got a few firms that have very high levels of market share, you might have those particular businesses with a significant amount of market power, and that's something that they might choose to exploit. Okay, so that's the first characteristic we need to bear in mind. And again, these are all listed on page 5 in your booklet. The second thing we need to bear in mind is something called barriers to entry, and one or two of you might be familiar with this as a concept, but that's essentially where you have factors which make it difficult, or in some cases impossible, for firms to enter an industry and to compete with existing producers. So it may well be that a huge barrier to entry in the car industry would be that if we decided we were going to set up a car business, we'd have to spend significant amounts of money, millions and millions of pounds, setting up a car production line. And clearly that would create a barrier to entry, because how would we be able to afford to do that? Okay, so there's one example. Okay, clearly any existing producer is going to have significant advantages because they've already set up the business and also got a product that's been produced. So effectively, they are going to be in a very strong market position in comparison to you entering a market for the first time, particularly if there are these very high barriers to entry. There might also be barriers to exit. Okay, so those might be factors that make it more difficult, or in some cases impossible, for firms to cease production and leave an industry. And they can sometimes be something called sunk costs, where if you effectively have to spend a load of money developing your brand and developing your awareness, well, you're never going to get that advertising revenue or advertising spend back. And so in some cases where you've had significant levels of investment in getting into a market, that might also create a barrier to exit as well. The extent to which goods are similar in the market. Now, that is clearly very important. Okay, so in some instances we have homogeneous goods, and in various different markets that you could probably describe, and I'd like to go and have a little think about it. Goods that are made by different firms, but which are basically identical. Okay, so homogeneous goods, there's no difference between one product and another. Okay, so there are a range of examples that you can list, and also I'd like to go and do a little bit of research. But the next example, okay, so there is some space there in your booklet to jot down a few examples, maybe go and do a little bit of research, go and find some examples of homogeneous goods. But also the alternative is for goods to be differentiated. So rather than being homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. Sorry. So effectively, goods might be similar, but they're not identical. They're made by different firms, and they might be branded slightly differently as well. Okay, so what businesses are able to do, if they have differentiated products, they might have a unique selling point, and they can use that as a means to either gain market share or to sell at a different price. So they might be able to influence the price rather than because they are selling something different from everybody else, they may be able to charge a premium in some instances. Okay, so if we look at the next thing, which is sort of related to differentiated goods or differentiated brands, in some cases, if a brand is a very strong one, the name, the design, the symbol, and other features that distinguish that product from other similar products will make it heterogeneous. Okay, so effectively, if you think about an Apple, or Apple, the computer company, when they first brought out their products, they weren't that different from any other computer company or phone company, but fundamentally, because of their very strong brand and the very strong loyalty that engenders, in some cases they are able to demonstrate that they are providing a differentiated or heterogeneous product. Okay, and in some cases they're able to then charge a premium for that. Okay, so next area, and you can see there are 6 characteristics, and we'll keep coming back to these, or actually 7 in total rather than 6, to be honest. But there are these 7 characteristics that when we look at what those characteristics are, we should be able to pretty much then say, well, given that those things actually exist in this particular market, we can then take a fairly good guess, an educated guess, as to what type of market structure that might be, whether it be perfectly competitive or a monopoly market, where the significant power being held by one seller. So the extent to which all buyers and firms have the same market share, or that share the same knowledge, is another principle. Okay, so having perfect knowledge or information, and that exists when all buyers in a market are fully informed of prices, quantities for sale, and also producers have equal access to information about production techniques. So fundamentally, everybody knows exactly what's going on. So there's no asymmetric information. If you remember when we look back at some of the work that we did on behavioral economics and this issue of selling lemons, etc., then that's one of the issues, that in a perfectly competitive market there is perfect knowledge and information. So everybody knows what prices things are available for, and they have perfect information. Okay. The last one is interdependency. Okay, so it's the extent to which actions of one firm will affect the actions of another. And clearly, particularly when we start talking about some of the more competitive market structures, then interdependency becomes quite an important principle. Okay, so those are 7 really important characteristics that you need to understand. And whenever you're looking at market structure or looking to answer a question on types of market structure, having a grounding of these 7 key things will help you, because in some cases they won't necessarily say this is an oligopolistic market, but what they'll do is describe a case study where it's very clear, given the way in which they present that case study, that there are a number of firms in this particular market and they have significant market power, as an example. Okay. So let's take a look then at there's an exercise for you to complete on the table at the bottom of page 5, and it's asking you to consider perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. And then I'd like you to try and take a look and do a little bit of research maybe on what perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly are. Again, take a look in the Power textbook. That will give you some information. And then also, once you've broken down what the different types of market structure might have in terms of number of firms and barriers to entry and nature of product and any influence over a firm's price, also try and find some examples, and I know I've asked you to do that a little bit earlier on, but try and find some examples of businesses that you consider to be in perfectly competitive markets, monopolistically competitive, oligopolistic, and monopolistic markets. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of work to consider, and then we'll move on and take a look at some of the short multi-choice questions on page 6 as well. Okay, so we've looked at some examples here. So I want to add some examples in for homogeneous goods. So goods that are made by different firms but which are identical. Well, we've got 4 there: oil, wheat, gold, and steel. The products that people produce, although they might have slight variants, effectively oil, wheat, gold, and steel are pretty much the same products, aren't they? Okay, so they're known as homogeneous products. If we then take a look at some differentiated or heterogeneous goods, okay, so hairdressers or haircuts, obviously they are slightly different from one another, and also tins of baked beans. There are humongous numbers of tins of baked beans, and in some cases the only thing that really differentiates them is the fact that they've got a different brand upon them, although in some cases some of the recipes for the sauces are slightly different. Okay, so let's take a look then at the market structures characteristics table. Hope you've had a go at completing that, and let's have a look at and see how that might work then. Okay, so if we take the 4 specific market structures we've been talking about: perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, they are clearly the 4 key areas we need to take a look at. Now, we'll also look at how the number of firms, the barriers to entry or exit, the nature of the product, the firm's influence over price, and also some examples in this table. Okay, so let's take a look at perfectly competitive markets then. Okay, remember, a perfectly competitive market is where we are a price taker. Okay, we've got no influence over the price of the product that we're selling. The market is dictating that price, and we have to take that price. Okay. So in perfectly competitive markets, that we are price takers. Okay. Now, monopolistic, oligopolistic, and monopolistic competition, sorry, monopoly competition, are all price makers. So each different market structure, with the exception of perfect competition, they can actually make their price. They have some influence over their price, the price they sell their goods at, because they have differentiated products. Okay, so if we take perfect competition as the first example, then we've got many buyers, many firms, and so we've got a large number of buyers and a large number of firms in a perfectly competitive market. There are low barriers to entry and exit, so that means that businesses can come in and leave the market without it being hugely expensive for them to do that. The nature of the product in perfectly competitive markets is that they're homogeneous, they are identical. The firm's influence over price is absolutely none. It has to be the market price that is the price that you can charge for your product or service. And some examples, okay, the stock market is a classic example where there are a large number of firms, there's low barriers to entry, etc. The commodities market is another one where effectively we've got very similar product and very little influence over price. The market is deciding the price. And also we've got the foreign exchange markets, which are in the same way that the other markets are, very much down to the free market. And that clearly, in that case, means that we are price takers in that scenario. If we take a look at monopolistic competition, then again, you've still got many firms. In this instance, again, you've got low barriers to entry and exit. There are some slightly differentiated products. Okay, so in a monopolistic scenario, you've got lots and lots of different types of firm within the market, and they are able to slightly differentiate their product from everybody else. That does mean that they've got some, not much, but they have got some influence over price, because as we'll see from some of the examples, although they're offering similar products, they are able to offer slightly different ranges of products and services, and as a result might be able to influence the price that they are charging to a point. Some examples of monopolistic competition: one would be takeaways. If you think about all takeaways, they're all pretty much offering the same thing, but clearly they will have different types of food style and delivery, and obviously that means that they are offering a slightly different product from the rest of the market. Okay, local taxi firms, similar again, and local hairdressers. So where you've got lots, if you think about Bournemouth as an area, you've got loads of takeaways, you've got loads of different taxi firms, and you've got loads of local hairdressers that all offer something slightly different to the market. Okay, and so as a result of that, they have some differentiation, then they have some influence over market price. Okay, so you can see that as we move more towards a more competitive market, things start to change in terms of the market structure and their characteristics. So if we take oligopoly then, and again we will come back to define oligopoly in a bit more detail, probably I think at the start of 5b, which is the CC5b, so course companion 5b. So few firms in the market, barriers to entry tend to be quite high, and exit tend to be quite high, because to become an oligopolistic player in a market, you've got to be significant, have a significant size, and obviously have invested quite a lot of money in order to become one of those powerful brands. So if you think about the supermarket sector as an example, think about Tesco, Sainsbury, Asda, and a range of others, they are all quite big organisations with significant buying power. Nature of the product, again, heterogeneous. So in this case, though, rather than being slightly differentiated, they tend to be highly differentiated. Okay, so that might be based on the brand that they are supporting, and also the way in which they position themselves. But also, the products will be significantly different from some of their competitors. In this case, in an oligopolistic market, firms have some relatively strong influence over price because their products are significantly differentiated. Okay, and some examples include retail banks, car manufacturers, and also OPEC. Oligopoly. OPEC is basically the oil and petroleum exporting countries. So it's a very specific type of oligopoly, and to some degree that in some cases brings in things like cartels. But we'll talk about what that means in a minute when certain parts of an industry might collude together to price at a certain level so that they all benefit and maybe exploit some of their customers. Okay, let's take a look at monopoly as the next example then. In this case, we've got one firm who's supplying the whole market. There are very high barriers to entry and exit as a result of that. And again, because they tend to be quite big organizations, they might have to have invested quite heavily in providing service to that particular market. The nature of the product is heterogeneous and it's unique because there's no substitutes. Okay, so there's nobody else in that market. In a pure monopoly, there are no other alternatives. Clearly, in that case, if there are no alternatives, then if you're in a position, and particularly if you happen to be a profit maximizer, you're going to have a significant influence over the price that you sell your goods and services at. And clearly that can then be of great benefit to you as an organization. Examples of companies that are in monopoly positions, not pure monopoly, these are certain organizations that have a strong monopoly position in some of the products and services that they offer. So Microsoft, in terms of software, are in a very strong position, as you may know. The water boards are another type of monopoly, where in certain parts of the country, well, if you think about where we live, it's either Bournemouth Water or Wessex Water, I think, that have the Bournemouth Pool and Dorset sort of carved up between them. But within one specific area, each water board has an exclusive area that it covers, and so effectively it has a monopoly in that area. They are the only people providing water and sewage services, for instance, in that area. Another example could be Network Rail, who are responsible for looking after all of the rail network across the country. Okay, so some examples there of market structures and market characteristics. Okay. So let's take a look then at the questions that are on page 6. So you've got 2 questions, one which is a multi-choice question, and then you've got a second question which is broken down into 3 parts. Okay, and that's talking about the fast food industry in the UK. Also, the second part asks you some questions about KFC and how does it differentiate its product or service, and also to what extent do you think that restaurant is able to exercise power in the market? Okay, so I'd like you to give that some thought, have a go at some of those questions, and then we'll go through the answers together. Okay, and then I think we might well stop, or shall we look at the objectives of firms? Let's see how we go on the questions and the explanations, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, so let's just move this out of the way again. So which of the following markets has characteristics closest to the model of perfect competition? So in this instance, we'd need to look at what perfect competition is, okay, and then compare and contrast which ones have what we think to be the closest to perfect competition. Remember, perfect competition is where you've got lots of buyers and sellers, very similar products, and not something identical products. So look back at some of the criteria and then see if you can have a go at answering that question. Okay. So, in terms of the closest to the model of perfect competition, the answer in this case would actually be the wheat market. Okay. Now, the reasons for that is it's obviously a commodity product, it's a uniform product, it's exactly the same within reason. When you think about the process of producing wheat, it's a very similar product to anybody else who's going to produce wheat. Okay. There are clearly quite low barriers to entry, relatively low startup costs. All you need is a field and some grain to be able to, and a bit of water and some fertilizer perhaps, but relatively speaking, low barriers to entry. The other four alternatives, so pharmaceuticals, telephone services, banking services, and steel, all have very high barriers to entry. Okay, and so as a result of that, they would not be a model that was that close to being perfectly competitive. Okay, so let's take a look then at the next questions then on page 6. So in this case, we've got market structures that we need to consider, but let's just take a look at these market structure modules in the modelers in the first instance then. Okay, now the reason for using these market structures is really to do with how we can use these models to help to analyze and evaluate, and particularly when we're talking about different types of allocative efficiency, and that's something allocative and productive efficiency, which is something that we'll keep referring back to. What we've got to remember is that these models, some of these models are, as we'll see, and as I'll mention on more than one occasion, I would imagine, some of them are almost so theoretical that you're never likely to see a market that is either perfectly competitive or absolutely 100% monopoly. Okay, so what we're doing though is using these different benchmarks. So a perfectly competitive market is considered to be as allocatively efficient and as productively efficient as a market can get. So in essence, any business, any economist, in order to try to achieve successful allocation of resources and the most efficient allocation of resources, would be looking for markets to become as close to perfectly competitive as they could be. Okay. Now, one could argue when we look at that and break that down into a bit more detail, actually, it's quite difficult for a business to work in a perfectly competitive market, because simply, if we look at the way in which allocative efficiency and productive efficiency works most effectively, then that there is no profit incentive for people or for businesses to work in that particular market. However, in terms of the economist's view, in terms of trying to allocate resources in the best possible way and to help try to solve the basic economic problem, then that is considered to be a very good benchmark to use. Okay, so these models, these structures that we're talking about, essentially are models that we'll find out some more about as we go through this process. And they offer a benchmark to be able to say how efficient or how well does that serve a particular market, okay, and whether there are advantages and disadvantages to maybe considering different market structure models. Okay, so clearly, if we think about this, then the more widely a market is defined in its geography or products, the more competitive it's likely to be. If you think about that, then obviously in a certain situation, if we think about the hotel industry within a 2-mile radius of school, you've got a significant level of competition and very, very tough competition within that 2-mile radius. But if you then consider how many there are across the entire UK and think about the concentration of that particular industry in different parts of the country, that clearly is going to be much more competitive in certain parts of the country than it is in others, dependent on the level of competition that might be in the local area or the local geography. And obviously, you can go and take a look at that if you want to, and look at the hotels, the number of hotels that are available in different parts of the country. So there is a link there for you to go and take a look at if you'd like to. Okay, so let's take a look then at the questions on page 6, and then I think we will take a break, and then that will give you a chance to get your head round Quite a big area that we've covered, not that many pages in the booklet, but clearly this principle of market structures is a really important one for you to understand. And there are some notes within Powell that you can also take a look at, which hopefully will help you to understand this process. Okay. Now, what we'll end up doing a lot of the time, whenever we're talking about market structure, is trying to apply market structures or trying to take information from a case study or a data response question to see whether different markets or different companies are in different types of market. And in this case, where we've got this three-part question, 3A, 3B, and 3C, what we're trying to do is to explain to some degree how we understand how market structure might work, and then actually demonstrate in this case that there are some special cases, which is the case here. Okay. So first things first then, which market structure best describes the fast food industry in the UK? So give yourself a bit of chance and go and do a little bit of research, or go on the internet and find out what market structures are considered to be the fast food industry in the UK, and why, what sort of characteristics does it exhibit? And then we'll run through some of the answers, okay? So in this instance, actually, you could argue that there are two structures at play, okay? Because if you think about it in a local sense, we have got monopolistically competitive situation going on, haven't we? We've got lots of local takeaways, each having a slightly different offer, and to some degree in being able to influence their price to a point. However, also very, very large amount of competition. Again, if you think about from a two-mile radius from where the school is, there are significant numbers of fast food outlets from Castle Point into the central Bournemouth, and a humongous number of takeaway outlets. Okay, however, you could argue that nationally, and if we think about KFC as the example, nationally it's probably a fairly oligopolistic market. There are some big players in the fast food industry on a national scale, aren't they? We've got KFC, we've got Burger King, McDonald's, and a few others. But actually, there aren't that many that have national chains. And so as a result of that, one could argue in this case, if we're talking about a national picture, then it's an oligopolistic market structure. But if we're talking locally, it tends to be much more monopolistically competitive, okay? Because there are, Chicken Tonight and Californian Chicken and Lord knows however many, there's probably hundreds, literally hundreds, Chicken and Blues, you name it. There are significant numbers of local brands that are competing in pretty much the same market with KFC. Okay, so let's look at the second part of the question in 3B. In what ways does a restaurant such as KFC differentiate its product or service? Well, some of you might particularly like KFC, some of you may not, but in this instance, let's look at how they might differentiate their product or service. So first things first, they're obviously very strong on their branding and advertising. They're constantly advertising and trying to differentiate themselves with the Colonel's famous recipe and finger looking good, but they dropped that because of COVID, because it wasn't considered to be a good thing to try to encourage people to lick their fingers anymore. In this instance, what they're constantly trying to develop a brand, trying to develop some awareness, maybe advertise offers to try and encourage people to buy again, or to maybe come and try them for the first time. Okay, so branding and advertising, very, very important in terms of differentiating its product. Basically, what do they sell? They sell fried chicken, as do a whole number of other organizations. But the brand and the heritage of that brand and the way they advertise is a way in which they differentiate themselves. They also have quite an innovative menu. Okay, so think about Crushham's ice cream sundaes and some of the other things that they're doing. Now, you could argue that all takeaways, all of the big takeaways, are doing a similar sort of thing. But by being innovative, by being sufficiently different, some people might choose to go to KFC because they like fried chicken, but because they can get Crushham's and they can't get those anywhere else. So that again could be a reason why, and a reason how they can choose to differentiate. Okay. And then the other thing that they also talk quite a lot about is the fact that they've got a sustainable supply chain. So they only use free range eggs, for instance, or their recipes are prepared in house. So that is an argument to say that again, that's differentiating them from other parts of the of that particular market. Okay. And then finally, to what extent would you suggest that a restaurant such as KFC can exercise power in the market? Okay, so where we're talking about a to what extent type question, you're probably going to need to try to balance that and come up with some options. Okay, so let's take a look at how you might choose to answer that. Okay, so clearly one of the things that we'd need to consider in this situation, where you're asking to what extent would you think that KFC can exercise market power, clearly it will depend on a number of things. Okay, the first thing it's going to depend on is how many and how close are the substitutes, like McDonald's, Burger King, and Pizza Hut, for example. If you've got lots of competition and close substitutes, then it may well be that KFC can't exercise a huge amount of market power, because in that situation, maybe where there are other alternatives in addition to all the fried chicken takeaways we talked about, that might mean that you're going to be limited in how much you can actually exercise your market power. There's clearly more local competition, as we mentioned. Okay, there's all sorts of different chicken restaurants, as we can see, and this is just, you could almost imagine any way in which you might describe a chicken, and there are even more. Okay, lots of local competition, which clearly is then going to have an impact on whether KFC could exercise their market power, whether they might be able to charge more than others, and clearly they are a strong market leader in the fried chicken fast food industry, but have they got sufficient market power to really influence the whole way in which they market themselves, and can they then justify a higher price and also develop greater market share than anybody else? Okay, so as a bit of a summary based on what we've covered so far, this is just a bit of a graphic to show you the principle between different type, or the issues as far as different market structures are concerned. Okay, so we're talking about perfectly competitive markets at the left-hand side of our continuum, where we've got more competition and it's considered to be perfection, or perfectly competitive for all the reasons we described. And then that moves from monopolistic competition through to oligopoly, and then finally to monopoly. And those are the key four different types of market structure. Clearly, a monopoly is much more concentrated in terms of being much less competitive, i.e. the less consumer choice in terms of what they pay for their product, but also the different alternatives they might be able to buy. And that is considered to be, as we move from perfection to imperfection, so perfectly competitive markets through to imperfectly competitive markets, and the further we move to the right, the more imperfect the competition is, in terms of the fact that you've got, in this case, a monopoly provider maybe exploiting its market position and charging higher prices and not necessarily allocating resources in the best way from an economic standpoint. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to have a think about that and get your head around that, and next time round we'll start to look at the different objectives that firms might have. Okay, so thanks for listening, and we'll catch up very soon.